Well, welcome to our study class today. I get really excited when I come across subjects that I get right into, and one of those subjects is the one that I want to talk to you about today. It's in the period of the time of the judges, and when we look at this period of the judges, what we really need to understand is that the judges appears in the book of Judges. That's pretty obvious. But also the book of Ruth is written during the time of the judges, and also the early part of the book of Samuel is written during the time of the judges. So often what happens is, because we have the Bible books placed in the chronological order the way they sometimes separate the stories the way that they actually appear in real life. So they don't just happen in order necessarily, that one story happens now and then that one finishes and then the next one starts and that finishes and then the next one starts. In many cases, and particularly in books like the book of Judges, many of the stories overlap, and in some cases you have two or three stories all happening at the same time. And so obviously when they're recorded, they're put down into the chronological order, but because of the breaks, we sometimes miss the connections. And that's the case with the subject that I want to look at today, because I want to look at the subject of two women, two very special women that are recorded for us in the Bible. And what we find is that when it comes to this period of time, it's an incredible time in Scripture, because the children of Israel entered the promised land through Joshua, which is the book right before the Judges. And so, having waited 40 years to go into the promised land, finally under Joshua, the children of Israel go into the land, and they conquer the land. And we know those famous stories, the story of Jericho and all the other stories that are associated with it. I love the southern campaign where they go from Upper Bethhoron down to Lower Bethhoron. I love the fact the sun stands still. And they obviously do attacks with all the different tribes and the areas around that part of the land of Israel. But it's when we come to the Judges, what we find is that just as quickly as they got all excited and inspired by entering into the promised land, they didn't complete the work. They didn't finish the work. And what happened was that the Canaanites and the Philistines continued to survive in the land, even though they won the initial victories. They didn't drive them out of the land like they'd been told to. And so the story of the Judges is really the response of those nations fighting back against Israel, fighting back against the various tribes, and sometimes even forcing the Israelites out of the land that they'd conquered, so that they had to live in the outskirts and in the hills and the valleys, and while the Philistines took control, and the Canaanites and the Amorites and all that took control. And so that's the period of time that we're looking at. And what it says at the end of the book of Judges is, it says that in those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. So people are basically just doing what they please. There's no king, there's no leadership, there's no direction. And so everyone's just sort of doing what they like. They're pleasing themselves. And in lots of ways, that's sort of like the way things are in the world at the moment. Everybody sort of just does what they like. And there's very little value and very little respect for the things of God generally. Just like there was in those days, as there are today, there are faithful people, and there were faithful people. And there were people like Caleb, and people like Salmon and Rahab, and there were people like Ruth and Othniel and Deborah and Ehud and Boaz and Ruth, just to mention a few. So there were faithful people in those days, as there is in this day and age. But generally what we find is that the general atmosphere and environment was one of people turning their backs on God and pleasing themselves. And what we find is that scattered throughout these stories is these occasional faithful people. And take, for example, the story of Hannah. That's one of the women that I just want to look at briefly. We know the story of Hannah well. We're not going to go into too much detail about it. We know her pain. We know her suffering. We know her humiliation about being childless, and how Peninnah, was basically having lots of children to the husband Elkanah, and of course poor Hannah, who was loved by Elkanah, but just couldn't have any children because she was barren. And so we learn about that story of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1, and in particular verses 4 to 18. And we know the story how that they were having dinner, and she just got so upset that eventually she went up to the temple to pray. And no doubt this is not the first time that Hannah has prayed about this issue, but it would appear over an accumulation of times that this is built up, this is built up, and this is built up. Because we see in the record that it says about Peninnah in verse 2, and it says that Elkanah had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. And then we find a bit later on that in verse 4 that Elkanah gave food to Peninnah and to all of her sons and her daughters. So it's not just 1 or 2 kids. Peninnah seems to have an abundance of kids, because all of the sons got something and all of the daughters got something. So it would have been a very difficult time. And as each child was born, the sense of humiliation and shame and embarrassment for Hannah would have grown with each child that Peninnah had. And so eventually it gets to the crisis point, and she goes to the temple and she prays. And it's almost like this is her last chance at becoming pregnant, about conceiving. And maybe she's getting a little bit older, and maybe she's getting to the age of life where it's not so easy to have children. And so maybe she felt that this was her last opportunity, this visit to the temple in Shiloh. And so she prays to God. And of course, Eli sees her praying, but doesn't hear any voice, and he's not really sure what's going on. And eventually he goes up to her and she speaks with him, and he speaks with her. And when he understands the story, he blesses her. And what we're told in this story is that she tells Eli that she's made a vow to God. And her vow to God was that if you give me a man-child, if you give me a son, I will give him to you. The word says lend, but basically it says, I will give him to you, and he will work and serve you, O Lord God, all the days of his life. And so that was the vow that she offered, and Eli commended her for that and blessed her and told her to go in peace. And she went in peace. Now she was happy. Now she was able to eat again. And it says that she was no longer sad. So it's almost like now she's at peace, that she's handed everything over to God, and it will be God's will. And it's a great lesson for us when we think about our lives, because how often do we struggle with things that are not going well in our life, with our struggles, whatever they might be, the circumstances of our life, whether it's to do with poverty or employment or sadness or loneliness, whatever the circumstances of our life might be, we may struggle with it, and it builds and builds and builds and builds. But eventually we've got to come to God and say, listen, God, I can't handle this anxiety. I can't handle this pressure. I can't cope with this anymore. I'm handing it over to you. And finally we offload all of those issues of life and we hand it to God. And there's like this peace that comes over us and go, well, now it will be God's will. And we may not always get the answer to our prayer the way that we would like it, the way that, if we were handing out prayer wishes. But what we do know is that God will answer our prayer, and he'll answer it for our betterment. He'll answer it for us to be able to continue in faith and hope and love. And so that's what Hannah does in this story. And now, having made a vow, she goes back, and of course, what happens is she goes back home with Elkanah, and she conceives. And she falls pregnant, and in the fullness of time, she has a child that she's going to call Samuel. Now, when we're looking at these stories, what I really want you to understand about these two stories is that the overlap of the stories that are taking place here, we have a time chart here. And you can see in this time chart that we're looking at around about the year 1152, 1153 BC, before Christ. Now, these dates, we can't be really sure about these dates. Most commentators have a variation of these times. But what most commentators, nearly all commentators, agree is that in this 10-year period, whether it's 1153 or 1185 or whether it's 1090, what they generally all agree on is that there's about a 10-year period from 1150 through to 1140 where a number of things happen all in this same time period. So Hannah prays her vow, and then her prayer is answered with the birth of her child, Samuel. At the same time as Samuel's being born in a different part of the land of Israel, Jephthah is making a vow, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, and he's going to make a vow that incorporates a burnt offering. Then at the same time, just a few years later, Samuel is brought to the temple before Eli, and Hannah is going to offer a burnt offering, and we're going to talk about who's going to raise Samuel. And then also around that same time, Manoah's wife, who is also barren, can't have children like Hannah, she suddenly has a visitation from an angel and is promised a son, and that son is going to be Samson. And Samson, when he's born, he's going to be a part of a vow too, a Nazirite vow, which is what also Samuel was going to be. So, and so we see these things all unraveling in this same time period with two women. Both these women, and both these women have God-fearing men in their lives. We find that Hannah has a God-fearing husband, and we find that Jephthah's daughter has a God-fearing dad. One woman is barren. The other woman would appear to be fertile because she was looking forward to getting married and having a child. That was Jephthah's daughter, because shortly she's going to be bemoaning the fact that she's going to be a virgin the rest of her life. And so we have these two women. One is fertile but is not going to have children. The other is barren, who's going to start having children. And they're both going to be involved in vows. Hannah makes a vow to God about Samuel, and Jephthah is going to make a vow that's going to impact his daughter. And of course, when we come to that story of Jephthah, which we find in Judges chapter 11, the circumstances of the story is that Jephthah is an illegitimate child, and he's a part of a large family, but he's the illegitimate son that is eventually thrown out of the house by his brothers because he's an illegitimate and he's a stepson or a stepbrother, and they don't want any part of him until suddenly the Ammonites rise up against him, and because Jephthah is a mighty man and a great soldier, then they have to go and beg cap in hand and say, look, can you come back home, because we really need you to be our leader. And so Jephthah's very suspicious about all of this, but he eventually decides to go back, and he goes back to his home city of Mizpah, and he basically promises to lead the people. And what happens is, in Judges chapter 11 and in verse 29, we read these words. And when we think about this story, because there's a lot of preconceived ideas about what happens in this story, because there's many that think that Jephthah is going to kill his daughter and offer her as a burnt offering. But I want you to see the build-up to this story. So it starts in verse 29, where we're told that the Spirit of the Lord, that's the Spirit of Yahweh or Jehovah, comes upon Jephthah. So this man is a spiritual man, and God is with him. The Spirit of God is with him. And the Spirit of God impacts him to be able to have this amazing victory. But before he sets off on this amazing victory with the Spirit of God, it says in verse 30 that Jephthah vows a vow unto the Lord, unto Yahweh or Jehovah, and says, if thou shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into my hands, then it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the children of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's. Now, we need to read those words carefully. Whoever comes through the door shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. And then we jump down to basically verse 39, and it says, and we'll come back to some of this, but then it says, and it came to pass at the end of 2 months that she returned unto her father, who did with her according to his vow, which he had vowed, and she knew no man. So the presumption by many commentators is he made a vow that he would give the person who came through the doorway to the Lord as a burnt offering, and then a little bit later on, after 2 months, he did that. But we need to read carefully and look closely at what's going on here. First of all, when we talk about whether he offered his daughter as a sacrifice or not, we need to understand and be really clear that there is no provision for any human sacrifice, children's sacrifice, burning offerings of sacrifice relating to children or human beings. There is no provision for that under the law. And if anybody was to make an offering in regards to that sort of matter, it would require the involvement and the consent of the high priest. And that was never going to happen. Now, what was the vow? Well, the vow says that whatever comes forth of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return, I will surely give it to the Lord, or it shall surely be the Lord's. So what's the background of this story? Well, as I said, the background is that originally he lived at home. This is Jephthah. He got thrown out of his home, and we're told in verse 3 and verse 5 of chapter 11 that he went and dwelt in the land of Tob. We're told that twice, and that's to the east of where Mizpah was. So he leaves the area of his home and he goes and lives in Tob. And it says that they came to him in verse 6, and they said unto Jephthah, come and be our captain, and that we might fight the Ammonites. So the possibility is, and the logic is, that he's living in Tob, and if he's living in Tob, he'd be living there with his wife and with his daughter. His wife's never mentioned in the story, but there's obviously been a woman at some point, and because he's a spiritual man, the assumption is that she's either still around unless she's passed away. But certainly the assumption could be well made that Jephthah's daughter is living in Tob. And then off he goes to his war campaign, and he's successful. And it says a bit later on that when he returned, that his daughter, and we'll read these words again, look at it says, and it says that in verse 34, and when Jephthah came unto the house, behold, his daughter came out to meet him with timbrels and with dance. So she's all dressed up and excited to celebrate the victory. And so in all likelihood, she has moved herself from the area of Tob, and she's come home to the house of Mizpah to celebrate her father's victory. His assumption, I would presume, is that there's no chance of his daughter coming through that doorway because she's in Tob. And perhaps that answers the question as to why it was that he was so surprised to see his daughter come through the door. But we also must make this assumption. He says in verse 31 that when I return home, he says, whatsoever comes forth of the doors of my house to meet me, I will offer it to the Lord. So he's expecting something to come through the door of the house. And the assumption has to be that he surely didn't just expect it was going to be a goat or a sheep. Surely his expectation was there's a 50-50 chance that it could be a human as well as an animal or anything of that sort of nature. But in his mind and in his heart, the assumption would be that, well, it's not going to be my daughter, but whoever it is, I will commit that person to the service of the Lord. In the same way that Hannah has made a commitment to her son to serve for God, so this man is making a commitment that somebody is going to be given to the service of God. And so, of course, the shock is that when his daughter comes out, that was something he didn't expect. Verse 35 says, it came to pass when he saw her that he rent his clothes. Now, why is that so devastating to him if he's not going to sacrifice her? And the answer is to be found in the fact that she is going to be given to the Lord, and she's going to bewail or cry or think about her virginity, that she's going to stay a virgin all the rest of her days. She will never have a child. And the scriptures are at pains to point out that this is his only daughter. There are no sons. This is the end of his family line. And any prospects of him and his family heritage continuing rests with this young girl. And of course, with the vow that he's made that she would serve the Lord, and therefore no longer have any prospects about getting married and no longer have any prospects about having children, his vow brought an end to his family line. That's where his situation is, and the regret for making a vow that he now thinks, what have I done? It was, in my opinion, never a vow that was going to result in her being sacrificed. When we look at Hannah, what did Hannah do? Hannah made a vow. And the vow was that if you bless me with my prayer wish and grant me a male child, I will give him to the Lord. And what did she do? She was granted her prayer request. She was blessed with a man-child. Then she asked for time to wean the child, which would have, we assume, been 2 or 3 or 4 years. So she has that period of time. She takes that time to wean the child, and then she brings young Samuel to Eli and to the temple. But she doesn't just bring Samuel to the temple when she hands Samuel over. She brings a bullock with her. Both Elkanah and Hannah bring a bullock, and they offer a burnt offering. The burnt offering was the consummation of the vow. It wasn't the vow, but it was the consummation of it. When she promised to give Samuel to the Lord, she didn't think, well, I'm going to offer him as a burnt sacrifice. She knew that she was going to give him and he was going to work for God. And he would work for God all the days of his life. And that was a vow and a sacrifice that she was prepared to make. And she consummated that vow with the burnt offering. We know that that also happens with Samson in this same time period. Even though there was no vow given at the time that the angel visited Manoah and his wife, what we do know is that he was given a Nazirite vow. And that when Samson was born under the Nazirite vow, what did Manoah and his wife do? They offered a burnt offering to consummate that promise, that vow. We know that Abraham, when he went to offer Isaac, Abraham was never going to actually be allowed to slay Isaac. God was never going to allow him. He just wanted to test him, to see what was in his heart. Would he obey me or wouldn't he obey me? And because God's law says in Deuteronomy chapter 12 and in Deuteronomy chapter 18 that you're not to offer human sacrifice or children's sacrifice or burnt offerings of human beings, because that was the law of God. God was never going to compromise his own law. He was never going to break his own law, but he was going to test Abraham. And of course, once Abraham raised his hand to slay his child, God stopped him, and then God provided a ram for a burnt offering again. And so that promise that God made was consummated again with the burnt offering. We need to understand that the vow is separate from the actual burnt offering, as it is here, I believe. I believe that what has been offered here by Jephthah is that the person who comes through that doorway is going to be offered to the Lord in the same way that Samuel was offered to the Lord. And that what was going to happen is that the common in relation to the burnt offering meant that the vow was going to be consummated by Jephthah with a burnt offering. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense when she says, that's Jephthah's daughter, says, can I have 2 months? Hannah asked for a period of time to wean the child. Jephthah's daughter asks for 2 months, and it says in verse 37 that she said unto her father, let this thing be done for me. Let me alone 2 months that I may go up and down the mountain and bewail my virginity. Now, I don't know about you, but if my dad said to me, look, I got some bad news for you. You are going to have to be offered as a burnt offering to God because I made a promise to him. So I'm going to have to kill you. And just so you know what happens with a burnt offering, that if you're going to offer a burnt offering, you have to bring a bull or a ram. In this case, those who would suggest that Jephthah was going to kill his daughter. We now substitute the daughter instead of the bull or the ram. And what they had to do with these bulls and rams is the first thing after killing them, they had to skin them. Can you imagine Jephthah being so brave to actually skin his daughter? Take all the skin off her after he's killed her. And then what you would do with the bullock after you've skinned the bullock, then you would cut it up into pieces. Can you imagine him cutting his daughter up into pieces? And then after he's cut up into pieces, then you take all the pieces and you wash them. And you wash the insides and the outsides in preparation for the offering. Can you imagine this man taking his daughter, skinning her, chopping her up, taking her parts, washing them inside, outside, and then laying them all out in a neat pattern on the altar and then burning them, because that's what a burnt offering is. And she would understand what a burnt offering is because her dad would have offered burnt offerings in the past through the temple and through their faith. But she doesn't mention anything about dying or being burnt or being sacrificed. She just wants time to bewail her virginity with her friends. I'm never going to get married. I'm never going to have children. And so I believe that this story is talking about a vow that was going to commit this young woman to now work and serve for God, most likely in the temple. And so where's the happy ending in all of this? Well, I think it might be found in the providence of God, in God's timing. In God's timing. We opened up talking about how the book of Judges and Ruth and Samuel, how they overlap and interlocked into each other. How that on occasions 2 or 3 stories are all taking place at the same time. And although I can't prove this point, I believe there is strong circumstantial evidence to suggest that when Jephthah's daughter completed her 2 months of mourning for her virginity, that Jephthah would have taken her. He would have taken his daughter to the temple for work and service in the temple to serve God in any capacity she could. And if this was the case, it's almost certain, in my mind at least, that a part of her daily work and her daily activities would have been to assist the aging Eli. You know, Eli was now getting on in years. He was 70 plus years old at this stage. He's going to die at the age of 98, but we're told in these passages that he's now having difficulty seeing and his eyesight is failing. And what a blessing it would have been for a woman. A woman denied the blessing of childbirth. Just imagine that. Because of a vow. Denied the opportunity of being married, denied the opportunity of having children, having a seed, because of a vow to her God, to be suddenly greeted. Imagine the scene. Put yourself in the shoes of Jephthah's daughter, to suddenly be greeted by the aging Eli. And he has a stranger with him. A stranger who perhaps you haven't met before, with a little boy. And there stands Hannah, with a little boy, also the subject of a vow. And suddenly you have these 2 women. A fertile woman who had become barren because of a vow, and a barren woman who had become fertile because of a vow. And maybe, just maybe, Jephthah's daughter plays an invaluable role in helping Eli to raise Samuel in the house of God. And if that was the case, I can just imagine the amazing bond that Hannah and Jephthah's daughter would form over the years. We know that Hannah and Elkanah came to Shiloh, to the temple, every year. And we know that the story tells us that Hannah used to make a little coat for Samuel each year. And no doubt that coat got a little bigger as each year. And I can imagine the bond between Hannah and Jephthah's daughter, as Jephthah would have told Hannah about all the little things that he was getting up to, and both the good and the mischief and the things that he had done in the service of his God, and how he heard God speak to him, and all the things that were going on in the temple. And God's providence works in the most mysterious of ways at times. However this played out, we don't know. We will find out in the kingdom. I feel confident that Jephthah's daughter was faithful to her father's vow. She would have remained faithful to that vow because she agreed to do that. And God in return was faithful to her. And what a blessing it would have been as a part of God's faithfulness to Jephthah's daughter, that he provides a child for her to raise. A child to raise in the house of God, in the ways of God. While all around her, Eli's sons and his sons' sons created havoc. But here are these two faithful sisters with their children being raised in the ways of God. God would have been faithful to her as he is to all of us who put our faith and our trust and our confidence in God. May it be that our Lord Jesus Christ comes soon, and all these mysteries and these events that we're a little uncertain about at times, they might all be revealed to us. And what a marvellous, what a wonderful occasion it would be to think that such an action took place where Hannah and Jephthah raised Samuel in the house of God. And may it be that we get to meet them and talk about those things in the not too distant future. God bless. Amen.
O my Lord, as thy soul liveth, my Lord, I am the woman that stood by thee here praying unto the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord hath given me my petition which I asked of him. Therefore also I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord.